Hey everyone, welcome to a new assets walkthrough. I'm excited to go through this one, but I do have to admit right up front that this is a little bit of a more complex asset. Not in terms of scope, but in terms of what we're doing and just trying to explain this and portray this in a way that's going to make sense might be a little more complicated. So hopefully this makes sense. This video is going to be real quick. I'm going to try to make it as short as possible where I just show you just how to get started with this asset, and then in the next video we're going to be going through in greater detail on what is actually happening. Now, as you can see, I've done a lot of documentation in the scripts here. So you should be able to hopefully open up any of these scripts here and kind of get a good sense of what's going on. I tried my best to write a good description for it, but there was just so many of them, so chances are some of them are probably not as good descriptions as some of the other ones are. So let me know in the comments if any of them in particular are just can't quite understand, and maybe I'll rewrite them and try to explain them a little bit better. But here, let me go ahead and show you what we're going to be doing. So here is the demo project that you will get when you download the project. And you will notice that it's not super exciting looking, but I'm going to showcase what we can do here. So if I move around with WASD, we can see that I have this character here that is moving and responding to WASD. What I can do is I can hit enter, and then I'm brought up with my menu here, and I can start to remap these keys in-game to new keys. So now if I exit out of here, if I hit WASD, which you can see here, I'm no longer moving my character, but if I use the arrow keys, my character is moving. So that is the whole point of this asset. You'll also notice that we can map to Gamepad. So I have a Gamepad plugged in. So if I just hit down on the Gamepad. I'm pressing buttons on the Gamepad right now. And when I exit out of here, I can move with the D-pad. I can also come through here and map it to the joysticks, right? And I do have a little keyboard here being drawn here. That's just a visual representation. It really doesn't make a difference. Yeah, so here you can see that we're getting stick inputs and they're responding. When I press the D-pad, nothing's happening. When I press arrow keys, nothing happens, WASD. So we're fully swapping out the controls for this character here and doing this all in-game. And when we take a look at the code, it's like 30 lines of code total. But understanding those 30 lines of code is what this video is going to be about, and I hope that it makes sense. So please let me know if you have any questions in the end, and let's get started. Okay, so first thing we want to jump into is this script that I had pulled up a second ago, and this is our initializer for our key mapper. So this is what it's going to look like when you open it up, nice and concise, but you can open up and expand any of these documentation bits here to read more about what's going on. And this is the base level kind of underlying framework for what is going on in this game. It's just a series of maps and lists that we're manipulating the way that we want to. I've also named each of these regions doc underscore and then what they're called. So if you want to, you can hit Control Shift F and then you could search doc underscore. And here, this will allow you to just jump to any one of these real quick, no matter where you are in the project. So even if you don't have this open and you want to real quick try to find what it is that you're looking for, you can search it, come to it, and then you can expand it and start to read more of what we have going on. I don't have these doc tags in every script, just in this key mapper in this script where I have most of the documentation. Because once you understand really what's going on here, the rest of it is just like, oh, okay, we're just doing map manipulation and stuff. So I'm not going to go through these a whole lot. I'll let you try to read through here, but understand that the underlying premise of this whole asset is that we have a DS map, which is just a hash map, that just keeps track of some sort of device name that we've created, its map of controls. And a control, it looks something like this. So here's kind of the structure of what our system, our input system looks like. Right, we have some sort of input device name, we have its control map, and that control map points to another map here that has a control name and a key value. So here's an example of what that would look like. So here we have some input device name that we've named Gamepad Blue. That has its control map, which points to this control map here. And here we have some control called jump, and that is mapped to a button on the gamepad. Here we have move left is mapped to a joystick. Here attack is mapped to the spacebar. and here role is mapped to the keyboard key J. Now, why you would map all these keys to different devices, I have no idea. It doesn't make sense. But here I'm just trying to demonstrate that you have the flexibility to map these keys across any device that you want to. And they all get stored into this hash map here that holds these control names and their key values. So jump, move left, attack, roll will always have these key values that we're just referencing. And all we're doing is just updating, inserting, deleting from this map. And that's it. That's the whole asset. That's really what this is. But if you've never really kind of done this stuff before, it can be kind of overwhelming. So I've created these series of scripts for you so you don't have to understand how to do that. But you do have to understand it a little bit to get started. So yeah, that's what this input devices map is that we've created. Just a map. It's actually a nested map. So we have our map here, and then nested inside here is another map. So it's a double nested map, but it's not too bad. Like I said, this diagram I think does a good job of demonstrating what it looks like. So that is what our global.inputDevices variable is. And as I mentioned before, we have global.controls. These are the controls here: jump, move left, attack, roll, right? So here we want to just keep track of our list of controls that are accessible to the game, right? Because the game is going to have a predefined set of controls, right? Like you pick a game like Mario Kart, right? You can turn left, accelerate, brake, use item, turn right, drift. You know, these are a preset list of controls that the player has access to, but depending on what type of controller they're using, those keys might change. So we do want to keep track of which controls we're using, and that is just this list here. So whenever we add a new control key mapping to our input device map, it gets added into our global.controls. So here you can see an example of what that would look like is here's just a list of control names as strings: jump, attack, move left, roll, whatever we want to name them. These are all things that we're creating. Input objects is just our game objects that use our input system. So for example, here we have this O player here. That's the only object we have in the game really other than our game controller, but this O player is going to be considered an input is going to be considered an input object in that it is going to be an object that listens to our input system. So we want to keep track of these objects as we use them and make certain functionality a little bit easier. And here you can see an example of what our global.input objects list looks like is just a list of instance IDs. So OBJ player 1, its instance ID, O player 2, whatever we want. It's just going to be a list of IDs that are stored into this list. I will go into Gamepad ports and current devices and this stuff later. But for now, let's just get started with this, and then we will get going. Okay, so that's a great quick overview of what we're doing. So here I have a game controller, and this game controller is just dealing with our menu, right? So as I showed in the demo, let me pull it back up again. So here I'm drawing all this stuff on the screen, the game controller is doing that, and then I can navigate through this menu, right? This is all being done through the game controller. I'm assuming that you have some sort of implementation of this already in your asset or your project or your game or whatever you're working on. So this game controller probably won't exist in your project, but for me, I need something to draw this stuff to the screen, to navigate through the menu, blah, 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 blah. So just understand that that's what this game controller is doing. Okay, I shouldn't close that. I'll probably have to open that up a million more times. Let me run it real quick, and then I'll just hide it in the background. So, great. So let's get started. How do we do this, right? So here we have our player, and our player doesn't really have anything in it other than some drawing stuff. And our game controller doesn't really have much in it other than, navigating the menu. And then this is all just drawing the menu. So how do we get started? Okay, well, this is where we're going to start using some of the code. And this is what I mean that it's pretty straightforward in terms of how much code we need. We only need about 30 lines to do all of this, but it could grow larger if your project's more complex, obviously. So first thing we want to do is we want to call that script that we took a look at the beginning, and that is called keymapper init. Now, if you don't remember, this is the one that we just looked at right here that has all of our documentation. And this is just instantiating all of our lists and our maps that we're going to use. So we need to make sure that we call this script before we call any of these other scripts, otherwise nothing's going to work. Now you could put this in the player if you wanted to, but I'm going to put this in a game controller because this only needs to be done once per game, unless you call the key mapper destroy, which we will here. So make sure that when you're done using everything, you call this key mapper destroy script so that this will go ahead and destroy all of our lists and our maps. All right. So we have started up our key mapper. Great. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create what we're calling an input device. And I'm going to come down here to input device init. And if we open up input device init, we can see that we have quite a bit of documentation just explaining what's going on. But if we read through this, it says input device init takes in a string value that represents the name of the input device that we want to create. This can be any name at all, but I recommend you name the device with something relevant to what the device actually is, especially when using Gamepad controller support. Make sure to use one of the following words in your input device, Gamepad control. So here's an example of what an input device is going to look like. Input device equals wireless green controller. Again, some arbitrary name that we want to name it. And then this is just going into more information about the Gamepad support. So all we need to do here is input device init, and we need to supply it some sort of name. So I'm just gonna name this main controller. Okay, this could be anything. You could call this keyboard, gamepad, purple unicorn stick. I don't know, anything that you want. It doesn't matter. We are just creating this name. You just need to remember what this name is later because we're going to use it. And we don't want to define any sort of gamepad dead zone, so I'm going to leave the second parameter blank. And now we have created this input device called main controller. All right, well, as I mentioned before, our input controller, our input device is just a series of controls mapped to keys. Okay, we take a look at this. Global.input devices is a map, and each input device looks like this name with a map of controls mapped to keys. Okay, controls to keys. All right, so what we need to do is we need to add some controls and keys to this input device that we've just created. So I'm going to type input device, and I'm going to say new key. So first thing we need to specify is what input device are we adding this key to. So I'm going to say main controller, because that's the one we just created. And I am going to specify some control, and I'm just going to call this left. So this will just be moving left, right? And I want this to be, we need to decide which key it's going to be instantiated to. So for now, I'm going to set it equal to nothing, and I'm going to come through and copy this a few times. We're going to update this in just a second. So let's go ahead and create a few more controls. I'm going to say right, I'm going to say up, and I'm going to say down. If I wanted to, I could put something in here like jump. I could say, you know, attack weak. I can put whatever I want in here. And I'll show you how these are going to work later on. But these, again, are just whatever we want the game. So if this was Mario Kart, there would be one in here called drift. One that would be called use item or something like that, right? So these are whatever we want them to be. But for this simple demo, all I'm doing is moving up, down, left, and right. So I don't need anything crazy. I'm just going to put a few basic names in here. Okay, so now what do we want these keys to be? So I'm going to start off by defaulting this to the keyboard. Okay, so that's where I want the device to start out with. We'll transition to the gamepad in a second. But for keyboard, now if you've ever done any sort of keyboard controls, you'll know that keyboard check, and then normally we pass in something like VK right or ORD A. Right, these are the different types of things we can pass into our keyboard checking. So that's the same type of Unicode value we're going to use. So I'm going to set this equal to VK left. If I wanted to, I could set this equal to ORD of A, and this would be WASD keys. But I'm just going to do VK. I'm going to do arrow keys. VK right, VK up, and VK down. So this is just setting the default controls for this, okay? Nice and simple. So we've instantiated our key mapper, we've destroyed it. All right, so now if we were to run the project, we wouldn't really see anything happen because we've instantiated this input device and our key mapper, but we aren't tying it to any of our objects yet. So what I want to do is I want to come down to my player, which is going to be my input object, and I want to tell the input system that, hey, this player is an input object that needs to listen to our input system. So I'm going to say input object. I'm going to say init. Now here we have the option to specify which object we want to initialize, but since I'm calling this inside the object that is instantiating itself, I'm going to leave that blank, and that's just going to default to itself. If I wanted to, I could call this on oPlayer2 or whatever and have that be the object that we're instantiating, but for now we're just instantiating it on ourselves. So we aren't going to put anything for this first parameter, input object. But we do want to specify this input device here, and we want this input object, oPlayer1, to listen to this main controller that we created up here. So I'm going to type in main controller. And now, this input object is going to be listening to this main controller input device that we've created. Okay, so all we have to do now is, actually, I'm going to show you one more thing, and then we will start testing. Okay, so now we have this input object listening, right? How are we going to move this? So normally if we wanted to move this character, we would do something like if keyboard check VK left, and then we would say X minus minus, right? And this is kind of what our input system would look like. Obviously, it might be a little bit nicer than this, but this is kind of a very, very, very simplified version of what something might look like, okay? Okay, so this is pretty similar to, this is some pretty basic code. And if we ran this, this would work. Our character would move with the arrow keys. However, we're using GameMaker's input system here to check, and we aren't really using our game input system. Now, one thing we need to understand before we start to tie these two together even more is that it's pretty common for a lot of more advanced input systems to, instead of doing checking like this, we define some sort of variable. So we might say right is equal to keyboard check board D or keyboard check VK right. Okay, so here we're saying that this variable right is going to be equal to VK, or checking the keyboard press D or right. Now keep in mind that this bit of code right here is just going to return true or false, and this is going to be returned true or false, and this step event is ran every frame. So every frame right is always going to be equal to true or false, and it'll be equal to true if we're either pressing down the D key or the right key. And we could go through and we could do this for left, we could do this for up, and we could do this for down, and then instead of doing this keyboard check here, all we would do is we would just check for this variable. So then we would say this is kind of what our code would actually look like instead. Now, if this doesn't make sense, I recommend watching some more YouTube videos. Sean Spalding, Heartbeast, right? They do videos on input systems and how to do, like, you know, platformers, RPGs. This is how this usually works. And then this would get abstracted out to some new scripts that we would call like input, and then we would drop this in here, and this would keep track of all of our input keys, okay? So if this makes sense, we're good to move on. I'm going to delete this because we don't need to use this. We still want to use these variables, but we don't want to hard define everything like that, because if we have to hard define and write out the code for what right is equal to, what left is equal to, up and down are equal to, that defeats the purpose of having this key mapping system that does it all for us. We want these variables, right, left, up, and down, to constantly be looking for whatever our control key pair is in our input system. So there's one script I'm going to point to, and it is this one right here. I'll move it to the top, input object input. And if you'll notice, it kind of looks similar to what we were looking at before. We have these controls here defined. So let's go ahead and read through the description of this real quick, and I think it might explain a little bit more. It says this script updates the specified input object's input variables. So like we said before, right? Up, down, left, right are just variables that hold their input. For this library, we store all of the inputs into Boolean variables. For example, var left key equals keyboard check A. This is true or false if this key is down. And var up key is equal to gamepad check button. So this is the same thing, but just looking at our gamepad. True or false if the button is down. This is done to make the input system dynamic and read only one variable, but respond to all of our different possible key mappings that it can have. These input variables are then returned in an array for access later if desired. So we're not going to use this at all, but if you wanted to, I do return all of these Booleans in an array if you wanted to do that. But we can ignore this for now because we don't need to. We just need to look at this right here. Now, let's say you wanted to add keys to your game, controls to your game that aren't specified here. Say you were making Mario Kart, right? You want to just follow this format and say obj drift equals input device get key obj.input device, and then we would name it whatever we want it to name it, whatever it was named in when we created it. So remember here, when we created these, we named it left, right, up, down. So this is the name that it's looking for. And if we come back to here, you'll notice that we have left, right, up, down that are named the same thing. So we need to make sure that these variables exist. So you will have to modify this script to be compliant with your game. But this is the only script you have to modify. The rest of the scripts should just operate as they are. So like I said, you do have to modify this script, but this is the only script you have to modify. And I'll make sure to point that out in the documentation. So we'll also come down to here and just return this as obj drift. Now, if you wanted to get rid of these, you can delete these, but just know that these variables are going to get stored into an input object that we're going to use later. So if you want to add keys or add controls, remove controls, you can do that. Just follow the format here. It's pretty straightforward. Okay, so now, how do we get from there to this to here? How do we link all of these things up? Well, all we have to do is, sorry, I'm just taking a look at my notes here, make sure that I have it all correct. We just have to, in our input, our player objects, we just have to say input object update controls. Okay, and here we can put some parameters in there, but we're not going to put anything in there. You can read through the documentation if you have questions on that. And all input object update controls does is it just calls, it does some checking, blah, 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 and it just calls our input object inputs. So this just gets called. And what happens is left key, right key, up key, down key all gets stored into this player object. So it would be the same thing as just defining them here and saying left key is equal to whatever, right key equal to whatever. And these are variables that exist to the player. Instead of doing that, we only update them here, and then once we call update controls, that just gets stored here. So now all of those variables that we see here, left key, right key, up key, down key, those all exist and are assigned to our player. So now we can say, instead of saying if right, we can say if right key. And if you wanted to just use right and left and up and down, we could just rename these to right, left, up, and down. It doesn't really matter. But for now, they're named that. So I like to differentiate by putting some sort of indicator that this is a key. So like by doing like, K left is another way to do that, just so that I can keep these variables distinguished in my mind. That right key is different than right, which is just a string value stored in our map. And that those are two different things. They are associated to each other, but when I'm programming, I want to make sure that I'm keeping them separate so I'm not accidentally mixing things up and getting confused. So here I'm going to say if left key, if up key, and if down key, okay? So we're close. Now, the only thing we have to do now to make this work is we have to feed these variables into our input system. Because before, we were always checking, and right key would be equal to like keyboard check or gamepad check button, right? Something like this. But we don't want to specify which one of those types of devices are going to control it, because we want it to be universal. So all I need to do is I just need to wrap this around input check. And this is going to be using our input system to check for these variables. So rather than using keyboard check or gamepad check or mouse check, we are just going to be checking our input system and using input check. All right, I think that's all we need to do. So let's go ahead and run it. Let's see if this works. All right, so here we have our character, and when I move my arrow keys, my character moves around. Looks like I have left and right swapped, so let me go ahead and update that. Yeah, I should change this to... Okay, so everything looks good, all right? We have instantiated our input device, we've instantiated our key mapper, we've instantiated our input object, we've linked our input object to our input device, and now we're listening for it and we're responding to it. And the only time we're setting left, right, up, and down as the arrow keys as controls is when we instantiate it. So we do have to hard code some stuff at the beginning, but now when we move forward and we start to remap the keys, it's going to do all of this for us. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to go back to my game controller, and I am going to do some stuff. So here I'm going to check a global variable, and I'm going to say global.mapping controls. Now this is one that's included in our input system. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to go Control-Shift-F. I'm going to say doc_global. And I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to say global.mappingControls, open this up, and navigate to it. So here we see that global.mappingControls is a Boolean flag to tell our system that we are currently listening for the next input. Once this next input is received, then global.mappingControls is set back to false. But when this is true, the next input on a controller or a keyboard will be stored as the new input. And I said, note, this variable is specific to this project and this implementation of the keymapper library. Depending on how you decide to implement this library into your project, you may not need this flag. So here, this is in the step event, and this is going to be set to true when we're listening for the next input into a keyboard, into the gamepad, whatever that is. And I'm setting this equal to true inside my navigate menu. Again, as I mentioned, this is going to be restricted to my game, but what you can do is in your game, all you have to do is just set this global.mappingControls to true. And here I just do that when I hit shift. I just assigned it to a random variable or a random key. So here when I say if we are drawing the controls to the screen and keyboard press shift, I'm going to toggle it to true or false. So when we run the project here, you'll notice that when I hit shift, we're toggling into mapping controls. And so now the next key I press that's not shift is going to get stored into that variable, and I hit shift to turn it off again. So that's what that global.mappingControls flag is, and it's just listening for when we're supposed to be listening to our input device. So here I want to say, okay, we are listening for the next input device. What I want to say is I'm going to say input device map next key, and this is the main script that we use for mapping and updating the keys. So you'll notice that I have some scripts in here called input device update key, but that's only in there if you want to do that explicitly. If you don't want to do any of that by hand, you just have to use this input device map next key. And if you'll notice, we're listening for an input device and we're listening for a control. So if I just say keyboard, or what did I name my input device? Main controller. So let's come in here. I want to map my main controller. And what control do we want to map? Well, I'm going to say left. So now, if I go ahead and hit play, we're going to see some interesting things happen. So I go ahead and pull up, oops. Oh yes, so one thing we have to also do, and I forgot to mention this earlier, is we have another global variable. And I'm going to go ahead and search global doc underscore global. And here we have current device. So let's go ahead and read through what this does. String variable, global.currentDevice is a string variable that keeps track of the current device that we want to modify the controls for. One limitation to this library is that it only supports one device being mapped at a time. So you cannot change the controls to multiple devices at the same time. You may be able to achieve this with modifications to the library, but as of current, this is not possible. So we need to keep track of which device we are currently trying to modify. Global.currentDevice equals keyboard main. Okay, so we need to say that, hey, this main controller here, this input device that we've called main controller, this is the one that we are going to modify. So all I do is I say input device set current, and then I am going to pass this into it. Okay, great. So this is used for if we have multiple players. Let's say we have a multiplayer game and each player has their own device, input device that they're listening to. We need to update the current input device and make sure that that is being tracked properly. Otherwise, we aren't going to update the correct one. Since this is a single player game in this demo, we just have to call this once at the beginning of the game and then we're good to go. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this and come back to what we were doing before, which is mapping our keys. All right, and I hit enter. So now you can see that when I navigate through my menu and I hit shift, now it's going to be listening for the next key that I press. So I'm going to press P, and you'll notice that it didn't update up, it updated left to P. Well, why did it do that? Okay. Well, that's because we set main controller and we said control left is the one that we want to update. And update P was updated. So if I press another key, it's going to just keep updating. I'm pressing D-pad. It's just going to keep updating the left key. And if you notice, I have a Gamepad plugged in. It's already listening for Gamepad support. We didn't have to code anything. But having a Gamepad plugged in, it's already listening to what our Gamepad buttons are being pressed. So I just want to point that out, but that's pretty cool, right? Yeah, but anyway, okay, back to the issue at hand, is how do we map the keys that we want to map? Well, here we can't hard define which control we want to do. We need to be able to dynamically do this. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to say current control is equal to, and then this is going to be, again, specific to how I'm doing my game. So I have a variable called control index, which is just keeping track of where I am in the menu. So as I toggle this up and down, this is just 0, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 1, 0, right? So this is, as I change this up and down, my control index variable is modifying. So this, again, is specific to my project. But all that this is doing is this is iterating through our list of controls. So if you remember, we have this list called controls. And this is just a list of strings like jump, attack, move left, roll. So all I'm doing is I'm just printing this global.controls list here to the screen, and I'm iterating through it. So all I need to do to get the current control that we're trying to modify is just get that control index variable of our global.controls list, and that's the current control. So instead of here mapping it to the left control, we just want to say current control. Now again, this is going to change depending on your project, but all I'm trying to point out is here, this input device map next key takes a controller, an input device, and a control, and that's it, and it will update that key. And if we were to take a look at that, here we can see that it is just listening for the next input, whether that be through the gamepad or through the keyboard. Great, so let's go ahead and run this one. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and navigate to up. I'm going to hit a key. Hey, updated. If I press this, oh great. So we have everything updated, and here we have some nice debug messages showing that things are successfully getting updated. So now if I exit out of this and I go to press these buttons, it looks like only up, left, right, down arrow are updating, even though I have all of these different keys mapped. All right, well, why is this not working? Well, we only have to call one more line of control, and we just have to say input objects update controls. And now this is a little bit different than input object update controls. An input object is going to only update one input object, one that we specify, but input objects update controls is going to update all of their controls. And all that's going to do is that is just going to call this input object inputs, and this is just going to reassign these left key, right key, up key, down key variables by re-getting the new values that are stored in this map. All right, so whenever we update the controls, we need to make sure we call this. Now, if I didn't want to call this on every object, I could just say input object, singular, update controls, and I could pass in O player 1. And this would do the exact same thing. So now if I go ahead and play it, we can see that arrow keys move. Let's go ahead and reassign some keys. And now arrow keys don't move it, but WASD does move it. Great, and if I wanted to, I could go ahead and remap these to some gamepad. And if I start pressing the D-pad on my gamepad, we get some positive results. All right, I just want to show you guys one more thing, and then we're basically done with this. Now, there's a lot more that this library can do. It does support multiple players. It does support multiple input devices. But just to get you started, this video is already way longer than I wanted it to be, but I just want to show you one last thing, and then I will probably do another follow-up video where I go through all of the scripts and I explain everything that we can do with it. So I want to go ahead and come back to this menu, and if I press left on the stick, you'll notice that we start to see some kind of weird things going on here. And if I press right on the stick, right, so the stick values are getting stored in a weird way. And if we wanted to default this to a game stick, we would also have to kind of store this as a weird way. Now, I'm not going to explain why this works in this video, but I'm just going to say all you have to do is in this beginning, if you want to hard code these as joysticks, all we have to do is say GP axis, and we want the left joystick, so we're going to say L, and we want the horizontal value of that left stick, and we want to say less than 0. And this all has to be a string. Okay, I'm not going to explain why this works in this video, but I'm just going to show you how to do this. So to move right, we want to check greater than 0. To move up, we still want the left analog stick, but now we want the vertical value. We want that less than 0. And to move down, we want the vertical value to be greater than 0. So now if I run this, instead of defaulting to the arrow keys when we start the game, it is going to default to the joystick. What is going on? GP axis. Interesting, nothing is moving. It's, oh, come on, don't do this to me. You were just working 2 seconds ago. let's call input object update controls, and we're going to say, oh, player 1. Let's see if this takes care of it. Oh, we can't call it in there because it has not been instantiated yet. So trying to call that before this input object has even been created is going to be problematic. So, oh, yes, 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 this is great. This is great. This is great. So, one more thing I need to show you is that this input check function won't listen to joysticks naturally. This only listens to gamepad. This only listens to buttons, whether that be on a gamepad or on the keyboard. Because the joysticks are just so weird in how they behave, we had to add one extra method. So I'm going to say, if you want one of these controls to also listen to joysticks, we just have to say joystick check. And then we're also going to pass in the right key. All right, and that's it. So we want all of these to be potentially affected by the joystick. Now, if you never want a joystick to be able to control a specific key, then just don't put it in here. So now if we run it, now the object player is going to be listening for joysticks also, and as we move the joystick around, the character moves. And if we map different keys, I could say left is A, and I'm just going to leave the rest the same. Oops, I accidentally hit a different key. Now if I move the joystick, I can move every way except for left, but I can press A on the keyboard to move left. So you can do some really kind of weird, dumb things with this. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to go over in this video. Like I said, there's so much more that this library can do. I mean, you can see here that we can modify the ports on the controllers. We can update which device we're currently modifying. We can change new keys. We can remove them. We can remove entire controls from it. We can check to see if a device is considered to be a controller. There's a lot of stuff you can do, and I went through and I tried to document all of this as best as possible. So hopefully this is a great place for you to get started, and you can play around with this and get a sense of it. But really, this is it. This is the basics that you need. Once you understand how these few things work, and this part is probably the most confusing part, but once you understand how these things work, you're able to just plug this into any project that you use. And I mean, if we count up the lines of code that we did, what is this? That's 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So 19 lines of code, right? Obviously, that's not necessarily always going to be representative of every project, but it just goes to show that we can do all of this stuff really simply once you understand how this works. So I hope you guys enjoy. Please let me know if you find any bugs. First of all, that would be great because chances are I probably missed something. So if you find any bugs, please let me know. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And I hope you guys enjoy. Thanks for hanging out with me. All right, see ya.